that I want to start with is a little bit of a pivot first to thinking about aspects of culture, and then we'll talk a bit about history, history of the Chinese Empire a little bit, but then also thinking about interactions with the rest of the world, especially Europe, and then the rise of communism in China, the rise of Japan, all kinds of things to talk about. So one thing I want to start with is an aspect of culture in East Asia that's kind of interesting and unique compared to other parts of the world that we've talked about. So this is the idea of the importance of the teachings of Confucius. And so Confucius was a philosopher who was around 500 before the current era. And basically, people have made the claim about Confucianism really providing a set of values that really infiltrates a lot of thinking throughout the cultures in East Asia. Some of the big values that were part of Confucian philosophy are courtesy to other people and respect for people who were seen as sort of higher rank in you. This hierarchy is connected to things like age. It's somewhat patriarchal. So often men are seen as higher rank in this, but also these kind of layers of respect for different people that are older than you in society, especially. So your parents, your grandparents, things like that. So some people make the claim that in some ways democracy is a little bit of an antithesis to Confucian culture. Because if you think about the idea of democracy, everybody gets a vote and the votes count as equal. So the idea that, say, a young person's vote would be equal to an older vote rubs against the grain of that notion of more respect for older people in Confucius philosophy. Let's see. Sorry, let me see if I can get my slides to actually move forward. There we go. All right. So in some ways we can think about this as an extended notion of a kind of nuclear family with a patriarchal head. So like the oldest male person in the family is seen as kind of the person that holds the authority, and they're responsible for the family's well-being. And that we can think of that as the microcosm level of the household, but this also extends out into broader thinking about society or the country, where you have the emperor as kind of the grand patriarch of all society. In this sense, then there's sometimes limited roles for women. It's another culture where sons tend to be more valued, and there's more of a notion of having roles in public space for men versus roles in domestic space for women. And daughters are sometimes seen as kind of servants within home doing domestic work. There's also this interesting aspect where things like really trying to achieve making money, and selling goods and making profit is often seen as greedy and evil. In interesting ways that are, different in some ways than American culture, where you could argue there's a kind of glorification of trying to make as much money as possible. There is this notion that too much greed sort of disrupts the social order of things that comes with Confucianism. And so one of the things that this set of ideas does is it kind of opens up the expansion of bureaucracy across China. And we can, again, kind of think of this notion where everybody's got a role in some sense, you're kind of deferring authority to someone else. And so this would help a society have a high level of social order, potentially. Though one of the things that kind of comes out of this too is there was often heavy taxes because you've got this hierarchical system. And often farmers especially sort of revolted at this system, and that helped to kind of weaken control with some of the Chinese empires. So another aspect of culture I want to talk about here to, again, kind of think about how it touches down in different places. And one of the ideas we talked about was the notion of something that we call diffusion of ideas, right? The notion of how something, a set of ideas might travel across space, how it might touch down and change in different locations. And so I want to kind of zoom into thinking about Buddhism in this region to try to understand this idea. So we talked about Buddhism a little bit in South Asia, right? We talked about how Buddhism is an example of a religion that was kind of responding to the harsher tenets of Hinduism. Its founder, Siddhartha Gautama, was actually high-ranking. He was in the Hindu Brahmin caste, and he sort of rejects Hinduism and tries to find himself and find a way, or maybe lose himself, I guess you could say, but to try to get out of that cycle of death and rebirth and suffering. And so I want to talk a little bit about Buddhism broadly and how it touches down in a few different places here. So one of the things that we saw in Dr. Liu's presentations, both when he talked about South Asia and Nepal, where Buddhism is a big religion, but also in his most recent talk, we saw some stupas, right? And so these are structures that are often found in Buddhist cultures. And the idea is that you're not entering the structure itself, but it works in a way where you move around it in a clockwise direction. You can see this one has multiple tiers to it. And so as you're moving around, you're encouraged to remember the life of the Buddha, the enlightened mind of the Buddha, and to try to kind of bring yourself into that state. So we can think about, again, a couple ways that this touches down in different locations. One is Buddhism in Tibet. And so within Tibet, we see kind of the earliest adoption of Buddhist texts and translations of a lot of key Buddhist texts that came over from India. We talked a little bit about how there's not that many Buddhists in India, really. There was a lot of persecution of Buddhists, especially in the Mughal empires. And so these ideas move into Tibet. A lot of the kind of key texts get translated. And how the Buddhists interpret, or the Tibetan Buddhists interpret Buddhism is this idea of kind of a pantheon of different Buddhas, so not just one God, and then also people who have kind of achieve enlightenment and stick around on earth to try to help people, Buddhistas, and different sort of protectors of Dharma. And so we hear that same word that we heard within Hinduism, where Dharma is kind of the way, the path forward for people. Again, there's this kind of notion of trying to escape the cycle of birth and death, and to try to do this through compassion. But often the goal is to kind of stick around and help other people as part of it. And so the image on top here is an example of a Tibetan Buddhist temple, and kind of mirroring what we saw in Dr. Liu's presentation, often really ornate architecture, a lot of detail and color in Tibetan architecture. And in Dr. Liu's presentation too, we saw a lot of prayer flags. And so that's, one form of practice is creating these flags that might have prayers written on them and putting them out in the elements. And part of it is that they break down over time, right? They fall apart. And that's kind of part of the process. And so you can often see those on the landscape. With Tibetan Buddhism, one of the aspects of it is that there's this notion of having reincarnation, and the reincarnation of spiritual as well as civil authority leaders. And so the Dalai Lama is an example of that. And so he was both a spiritual and political leader of Tibet until the Chinese takeover of Tibet in the 1950s. And he was essentially exiled and made his way over across the border into India. And so that's where he and a large group of Tibetans live in exile in northern India today. Some of the other aspects of practice would be things like mantra, which is often a set of words or sayings, or mandalas that are kind of these visual aids for meditation. And so meditation is part of practice, but also rituals where there's offerings of food and flowers. Water is being a part of those offerings sometimes. And then also chanting and prayers and prayer wheels. We saw some prayer wheels in Dr. Liu's presentation. And the image here on the right is some Tibetan Buddhist monks. So in China, and I'm going to talk about Tibet and China as separate here, even though we can think of Tibet currently as a region of China, right? It is politically controlled by China. And so in China, the way that Buddhism touches down is that Buddha is sort of thought of as not just a teacher, but as someone who's a god to be prayed to for help and salvation. And there's kind of a combination here of aspects of Buddhism and something called Taoism, which we'll talk about here in a bit. And this even this looks different in terms of what Chinese Buddhas look like. The Tibetan Buddhas are often quite thin, with this kind of idea of stepping away from some of the pleasures of the world. But you'll often see these kind of plump, laughing Buddhas in China. And then we hit Japan, and we get another different interpretation of Buddha, or of Buddhism. And so rather than thinking of Buddha as necessarily godlike, it's this idea that Buddha, the teachings of Buddha can lead you to find the Buddha within yourself, right? So everyone has the potential to attain enlightenment. And the idea is how you do this is you meditate, and so Zazen is the meditation practice in Zen. And Zen really kind of strips everything down. It rejects the idea of studying scripture or doing religious rites or good works or any of that stuff, but instead, focusing on meditation, working on the self. And usually this is something that's handed down through the guidance of a master. And one of the interesting things about Zazen practice, you'll often sit for fairly long periods of time. You can see the person who's kind of leading it here, they'll hit you with a stick, right, to kind of like bring you back into, not getting lost in your mind, right? So it's often kind of thought of as a little bit severe, and you'll see the shaved heads, right? It's part of the practice too. So it came over to Japan in the 12th century. And again, this emphasis is on simple meditation and avoiding ritual, and this connection is trying to be close to nature. I want to also mention Taoism and think about how that touches down in China too. And so Taoism isn't necessarily like a religion. It kind of has these philosophical aspects to it. It's really kind of hard to describe. Based on the teachings of, I'm going to space out on what his name is, but they wrote Tao Te Ching, and this had a lot of little sort of pieces of general advice for folks. And the emphasis was, rather than thinking of a god, it's all about this notion of energy, right? And understanding energy as the Tao. The idea is to try to come into kind of spiritual harmony with nature, the rest of the world. And there's this kind of complementary nature of Confucianism and Taoism in terms of how they turn up in Chinese culture. Probably the most famous symbol from Taoism is the yin-yang symbol, and it's this idea that opposites make up a unity. And so again, it's this version of pantheism. So the Tao basically is this energy that pervades everything. And the idea is to have inner harmony by living in accordance with the Tao, living within the flow of things, essentially. Action through non-action. And the idea is that after one's life is over, you revert back to a state of non-being, which is just the kind of flip side, that opposite state of being. And so here's a quote from the Tao Te Ching: "Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished," right? So this kind of calm flow of things. And so here's a Taoist temple in Beijing and a Taoist monk. One of the things that you might see as a practice associated with Taoism is Tai Chi. So it's a popular martial art. And part of the idea of Tai Chi is thinking about the movement of energy through oneself. And so it's often a sequence of rather slow movements. And the idea is to try to stimulate that movement of energy for both health, vitality, and also self-defense. And so you might see people practicing in groups in public space. And then Shinto, and we heard a little bit about Shinto from Dr. Liu's presentation as well. And so this is an indigenous Japanese religion. And again, there's a lot of different practices that fall into Shinto, so it's a complex thing to try to describe.